It was merely a photograph of a cheerful family, yet the way the youngest child stood exposed something hidden. The picture had arrived at the Philadelphia Historical Society inside a scuffed leather portfolio donated by an older woman clearing out her grandmother's attic. Among piles of dull paperwork and yellowed receipts, this one image drew attention not because it was unusual, but because it was almost too ordinary. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, a specialist in post-Civil War African-American history, barely glanced at it at first. Another family portrait from 1868. Another solemn group posed stiffly before the camera, bound by the rigid formality of early photography. She had examined hundreds like it, but something made her stop. The photograph showed a family of 5. A broad, solidly built man in a dark suit with his hand resting protectively on the shoulder of a woman dressed in an elegant gown trimmed with a lace collar. 3 children stood in front of them wearing their finest clothing. The studio backdrop was the usual Philadelphia setup: painted pillars, heavy drapery, a manufactured sense of grandeur meant to elevate the subjects. Sarah lifted her magnifying glass, studying the faces more closely. The father's expression radiated quiet confidence. The mother's eyes carried a gentleness despite the photographic conventions that discouraged smiling. The 2 older children, a boy of around 10 and a girl of about 8, stared directly at the lens with that unwavering Victorian seriousness. But the youngest, a boy of no more than 6, stood out immediately. His eyes weren't fixed on the camera at all. He was staring at something outside the frame to the right, his expression impossible for Sarah to label. Not fear exactly, nor curiosity. Something more intentional, almost aware. "That's strange," she murmured to the empty archive room. She shifted her desk lamp, letting the light travel across the image. The photograph was in unusually good condition, the chemicals having aged with only minimal fading. In the lower corner, she could just make out the studio's mark: Whitman and Sons Photography, Race Street, Philadelphia. She jotted a note to look into the studio later and turned her attention back to the boy. Why would a child look away during such a significant and costly portrait session? Families often saved for months to afford professional photography. Every detail was important. Parents coached their children to stand properly, hold still, and present themselves with dignity. Yet this boy was focused entirely somewhere else. She adjusted the magnifying glass again, sliding it slowly across the photograph. The painted backdrop displayed imitation marble and classical scenery. But behind the family, half concealed by the draped cloth used for atmosphere, something reflected the light oddly. A mirror? Sarah's breath tightened. In 1868, some photographers used mirrors strategically to manipulate light or add depth, but this reflection seemed accidental, an exposed sliver of silvered glass peeking out from behind the curtain. It caught enough light to form a faint, distorted likeness of someone who clearly wasn't meant to appear in the picture. Her hands shook slightly as she reached for her scanner. This photograph, she realized, was hiding something, and the little boy with his diverted gaze might have been the only one willing, or young enough, to look directly at whatever it was. The next morning, Sarah tracked down the donor information. The elderly woman who had dropped off the portfolio was named Dorothy Peterson, and she had left a phone number. After 3 rings, a kind but weary voice answered. "Mrs. Peterson, this is Dr. Mitchell from the Historical Society. I'm calling about the materials you donated last week." "Oh, yes, dear. My grandmother's belongings. I hope they're helpful. Most of it was just old paperwork. Actually, there's a particular photograph I'd like to ask you about. A family portrait from 1868. Do you know who the people are?" There was a pause, then a soft breath. "That would be my great-great-grandparents, the Williams family, Thomas and Martha Williams, and their children, Thomas Jr., Clara, and little Samuel." Sarah wrote quickly. "Samuel was the youngest?" "Yes. He was my great-grandfather. Lived to 93, sharp as a tack all the way to the end." Dorothy's voice warmed. "He used to tell wonderful stories about old Philadelphia." "Mrs. Peterson," Sarah said gently, "would you be willing to meet? I have a few questions, and I think this photograph may hold something historically significant." Another pause, longer this time. When Dorothy spoke again, her tone had shifted, softer and more cautious. "What did you find?" "I'm not completely sure yet," Sarah replied, "but I believe your great-grandfather may have witnessed something important, something deliberately concealed." Silence. Sarah could hear distant traffic and the murmur of a television. "He told me once," Dorothy said finally, "that the day that photograph was taken was the most dangerous day of his life. I was only about 10 at the time. I assumed he was exaggerating. Old folks tell dramatic stories, but he was serious. He said that picture proved his family were heroes, even though no one could ever know." Sarah felt her pulse quicken. "Did he ever explain what he meant?" "No," Dorothy replied quietly. "He passed away 2 weeks later, and I never had the chance to ask. I've wondered about it my entire life. That photograph stayed in my grandmother's drawer for 70 years, and then in mine for another 30. I gave it to you because I hoped someone could finally make sense of his words." They scheduled a meeting for the following afternoon. Sarah spent the rest of the day digging into the Williams family through census reports, city directories, and property deeds. Thomas Williams was listed as a blacksmith with a workshop on South Street. Martha Williams worked as a seamstress. They owned their home, an extraordinary accomplishment for a black family in 1868, only 3 years after the Civil War. The children appeared in school records as well. Thomas Jr. and Clara attended the Institute for Colored Youth, one of the rare institutions offering advanced education to black children. Samuel, at 6 years old, would have still been at home. But it was a July 1868 newspaper scrap that made Sarah's hand halt over the archive table. The headline read, "In the blunt, casual racism of its time, local Negro family questioned in suspected harboring case, no charges filed." The story was short and dismissive. Authorities had investigated the Williams household after anonymous tips alleging suspicious behavior, but reported finding no proof of wrongdoing. The family insisted they were honest laborers, and the matter was quietly dropped. On paper, the law had changed slavery, outlawed by the 13th Amendment in 1865. The war over, freedom supposed to be absolute. Yet Sarah understood what many in the comfortable present preferred to forget. Abolition had not ended the cruel practices in every corner. In isolated southern counties and beneath corrupt local power, people were still being held illegally. Slavery persisted in shadow. The networks that had ferried fugitives north before the war had not vanished with emancipation. They continued, covert and careful, moving people toward genuine liberty, often all the way to Canada, beyond the reach of American courts. A shiver of realization ran through her. The Williams family, she suspected more and more, had been part of that clandestine chain, and somehow, impossibly, they had recorded that involvement in a single ordinary portrait. The next morning she stood on Race Street in Philadelphia's older quarter, looking up at the building that had once been Whitman & Sons photographic studio. Now it housed a cafe with exposed brick and pendant lights, but the shell of the original structure remained tall panes meant to draw daylight and lofty ceilings built to accommodate elaborate backdrops. Inside she bought a coffee and, between sips, asked the barista about the place's past. "It's been a handful of businesses," the young man said with bored nonchalance. "But yeah, used to be a photo studio. Owner keeps some old stuff down in the cellar." $20 and a winning smile later, Sarah had permission to peek in the basement. The subterranean room was cramped and dusty, storage for crockery and broken chairs, but in a shadowed corner she discovered 3 wooden crates stamped in faded ink, Whitman Archives. Her fingers trembled as she levered the lid off the first box. Inside, wrapped in brittle newsprint, lay glass plate negatives by the dozens, precious instants from the 1,860 seconds and 70 seconds, preserved in silver and glass. Portraits of local tradesmen, solemn families, children in their Sunday best, the visual ledger of Philadelphia's post-war middle class. The second crate held the business ledgers, meticulous entries of every client, session, and payment. Sarah rifled through to July 1868 until an elegant script resolved into the entry she sought. The 23rd of July 1868, Williams family, Thomas, Martha, children, full portrait sitting. Payment, $4.50. Special arrangement, evening session. Evening session. That notation pricked at her. Studios relied on natural light through those tall windows. Sessions were ordinarily scheduled in daylight. Why then schedule a family for the evening unless secrecy was required? Darkness meant fewer onlookers. Privacy, the street emptied of casual passers-by. She dug further. Most ledger entries were prosaic names, dates, fees. But scattered among them, a few times each month, were other evening sitters. The same phrase recurred, special arrangement. The surnames tied to those entries were notable. Cross-referencing them with civic records revealed patterns. The Pattersons appeared in abolitionist meeting minutes as conductors. The Morris household had been subject to 2 post-war searches by local law. The Hughes matron had testified in a freedom suit about an illegally held woman in Maryland. These were not random portraits. They were, Sarah realized, visual records kept by families who were entwined with Philadelphia's continued Underground Railroad activity. Why create such risky, indelible proof of illegal work? The answer settled in slowly. In a society that dismissed black testimony and treated black lives as less than credible, a photograph offered incontrovertible evidence. You existed, you had property, you had a family visual proof of your personhood and respectability. If accused, if dragged into courtrooms that presumed guilt, these images could stand as objective testimony to a life of dignity rather than criminality. But there was another, quieter annotation that made the hair rise on her arms. Beside the Williams entry, in a margin so faint she might have missed it, someone had jotted, Rem, usual precautions, R.M. Flipping pages, she found the same initials again and again, sometimes spelled out as Robert Mitchell or Richard Moore in different hands. A few pages later, a note read, R.M. departed successfully via back entrance. Package secured. Package, the cold euphemism of the era for a person being moved to freedom. Back at the Historical Society, Sarah placed the Williams photograph on her highest resolution scanner. Modern imaging could tease detail from dust and paper that the eye alone could not see. She focused on the strip of silvered glass glimpsed behind the painted curtain. At 400% magnification, the reflection remained a smear. At 800%, shapes resolved into something more definite. At 1,200%, the image stopped being ambiguous. There was a human presence, someone partially hidden in the shadowed space where the photographer would not occupy. The angle and position made it unlikely to be the photographer himself. This figure stood off to the side, obscured deliberately, a dark-clad silhouette with a face only suggested, hands drawn toward the chest in a stance that read like taut worry, strained hope. Sarah altered contrast and exposure, careful to enhance without inventing. The ghostly reflection held steady under scrutiny, a faint, accidental witness embedded in a family's attempt at ordinary portraiture. Historical photograph analysis was always a balance between precision and intuition. Push the enhancements too far, and you risk inventing details that never existed. But handled with care, you could uncover what had always been present, just hidden, overlooked, or obscured by time. The figure in the mirror gradually sharpened. A woman, Sarah thought, though the quality made certainty impossible. Young, perhaps 20 to 25. Her clothing lacked the refinement of Martha Williams's elegant dress. No lace, no decorative stitching, fabric that looked plain and worn, the attire of someone with limited means. And even through the haze of the glass and the distortion of the reflection, her expression held unmistakable emotion, raw, desperate, hope. Sarah leaned back as her mind connected everything at once. The Williams family had chosen an evening portrait session late enough that the studio would be empty, late enough that the street outside would be cloaked in darkness, late enough that no curious eyes would notice who slipped in or out the back door. They had arrived in their finest garments, positioning themselves as respectable, upright members of their community. And while they posed, while their children stood carefully arranged before the camera, someone else hid in the shadows, someone who could not be photographed, someone whose presence needed to remain invisible, someone the family was protecting. Little Samuel, just 6 years old, hadn't been absent-minded or restless when he looked away from the camera. He had been watching her, the woman in hiding, the person his family was risking everything to help. In hours, she would likely be moved along the secret pathway toward true freedom. And Samuel, with a child's unfiltered honesty, had looked directly at the most important person in the room, even though no one else could. Sarah reopened the newspaper clipping. The investigation had taken place in July 1868. The portrait was dated the 23rd of July 1868. The timeline aligned perfectly. The Williams family had been questioned, their home searched, and within days they commissioned a portrait that displayed refinement and stability. A visual reassurance to anyone who might suspect them. See, we are respectable, we are trustworthy, we are not lawbreakers. The portrait served two purposes, an alibi on its surface, and, hidden in a sliver of reflected glass, a confession. But as Sarah zoomed back in on Samuel's face, something else struck her. This wasn't the vacant stare of a distracted child. His eyes were fixed, purposeful, and at the corner of his mouth was the faintest hint of something not quite a smile, more like a subtle signal of recognition, a quiet understanding. He wasn't simply noticing the hidden woman, he was watching over her. In that small, unmoving body posed for the camera, the little boy was serving as a lookout. Dorothy Peterson arrived at the Historical Society carrying a soft, worn cloth bag. She was 78, her silver hair pulled back neatly, her sharp gaze taking in the room before she settled into a chair. "Show me what you found," she said without hesitation. Sarah laid everything out, the enhanced scans, the mirrored reflection, the studio ledger, the newspaper clipping. Dorothy covered her mouth with one hand. Oh my God, she was really there. "You knew something?" Sarah asked softly. "I thought it was just a story," Dorothy admitted. "Something my great-grandfather said when he was old. I thought, maybe he remembered wrong, or his memory was slipping." She reached out, her finger trembling as it touched the photograph. "He told me they helped people, that before he went to school, his home was a stop on the railroad. But I always assumed he meant before the war. I didn't think the timing made sense." "The railroad didn't end with abolition," Sarah explained gently. "It couldn't. People were still being held illegally in the South, and after the war, helping them escape became even more dangerous. There were no legal loopholes anymore. If caught, entire families could be punished." Dorothy nodded slowly, eyes glistening. "He told me he remembered a woman, just one in particular, said she stayed in their attic for 3 days. He used to sneak her food, said she sang to him once." She closed her eyes, humming a few quiet notes of an old spiritual, its melody heavy with sorrow, lifted by hope. "He was 6, Dorothy continued, and he knew that if anyone found out, his family would lose everything. His father's business, their home, his mother could be jailed. But he also said he'd never felt prouder. He knew helping her mattered more than anything else his family had ever done." Sarah reached into her file and pulled out another document, a passenger manifest from a ship bound for Nova Scotia, dated late July 1868. "I believe this might be her," she said. "A woman listed only as R.M., those same initials from the studio ledger. No details, just that her passage was paid by a private charity." Dorothy's voice dropped to a whisper. "Did she make it?" "The ship arrived safely," Sarah said. "After that, no records, no trail, which most likely means she succeeded. She reached safety." The two women sat silently, gazing at the portrait, a family standing proud, creating evidence of their legitimacy, and hidden in a sliver of mirror evidence of their bravery. "This photograph was taken right after the investigation," Sarah said. "Your family was sending a message. Look at us. We're respectable, educated, property-owning citizens. We'd never break the law. But they had. They'd just finished breaking it, and somehow they managed to hide the truth in plain sight." Dorothy smiled through her tears. "That sounds like him. He used to say the bravest people look ordinary. They do extraordinary things, then go back to their everyday lives as if nothing happened." She opened her cloth bag and carefully removed an old leather journal, its pages yellowed and fragile. "I brought this," she said. "It belonged to Samuel. He wrote in it when he was older, in the 1920 seconds and 30 seconds. I haven't read it in years, but I thought, maybe it might help." Sarah accepted the journal with both hands. On the first page, in neat, deliberate script, Samuel Williams had written at the top of the fragile page, "For my grandchildren, so they'll understand what our family once stood for." That night, Sarah sat in her small apartment, reading Samuel Williams' journal by the warm glow of a lamp. She didn't dare bring such a delicate artifact back to the Society's brightly lit archives. His penmanship was graceful, refined the handwriting of a man who had lived through eras, stretching from the remnants of slavery to the rise of jazz. Most of the entries described ordinary life, meals with relatives, business matters, Sunday services. But between those everyday notes were moments that made Sarah's breath pause. August 12th, 1923. It has been 55 years since the photograph. As always, thoughts of her return every July. I was only 6 then, but I remember her face as clearly as I remember the faces of my own children. Fear and courage lived in her eyes at the same time. Mother told me years later she had walked nearly 90 miles to reach Philadelphia, guided only by stars, and whispered directions from strangers whose names she never knew. She hid in our attic for 3 days, and I would sneak upstairs carrying bread and water, pretending I was a soldier on a secret mission. She thanked me once and called me her little guardian. I didn't truly understand what was happening back then, not fully, but I knew it mattered. I knew we were protecting her from people who meant her harm, and I knew that if I ever spoke a word of it, even to my best friend, everything we had could be destroyed. Sarah gently turned the fragile pages until another passage caught her eye. November 3rd, 1931. A young fellow visited my shop today, asking questions about the old days, the years right after the war. He said he was a historian researching how the railroad operated in Philadelphia. I gave him the same answer most folks give: brave people doing dangerous work, though much of the story is lost. I didn't tell him about the photograph. I didn't mention R.M. Rachel Martin, a name I didn't learn in full until 1889 when she wrote to Mother from Toronto. By then I was a grown man with my own children. Reading her letter, realizing she survived and had made a life in freedom, I cried in a way I hadn't since I was a boy. Mother kept that letter. I hope my daughter preserves it too. And someday, when telling the truth won't endanger anyone, I hope someone finds it and understands what ordinary families risked in extraordinary times. Rachel Martin. Sarah wrote the name into her notebook, her fingers trembling. At last, a full identity to match the faint figure reflected in that century-old photograph. She turned to the next entry. July 23rd, 1935. 67 years have passed since we posed for that photograph. I am 81 now, the last living person from that room. Thomas Jr. died in 1918. Clara passed in 1929. Mother and father have been gone for decades. Even the photographer, Mr. Whitman's son, died last year. I attended his funeral, and afterward his grandson asked if I'd known him well. I said only as a customer. But the truth is, Whitman Jr. was as courageous as any of us. He risked his livelihood, his reputation every time he opened his studio after dark for families like mine. He looked the other way when an extra visitor slipped in through the back entrance. He created portraits that doubled as alibis, while accidentally or perhaps intentionally capturing shadows and reflections that revealed more than anyone intended. I wonder if he knew the mirror caught her image. I wonder if he left it there on purpose, a silent witness for future generations. I'll never know, but I like to believe he did. Maybe that photograph was his way of saying, "This happened." These people were heroes, and one day, when it's safe, someone will understand. The final meaningful entry came just weeks before Samuel's death in 1961. I told my great-granddaughter Dorothy about the photograph today. She's 10, bright as summer sunlight, and she asked why everyone looks so serious in old pictures. I told her we weren't serious, we were brave. I told her that photograph was taken on the most dangerous day of my life, and that it proved our family acted with courage, even if the world could never know. She looked puzzled, and perhaps I rambled, but I want her to understand someday. It's ordinary people doing extraordinary things that hold the world together, not generals or presidents, but families opening doors in the dark, photographers dimming their lamps so someone can slip away unseen, little boys keeping secrets that could ruin everything they love. That photograph sits in my daughter's drawer now. I pray it lasts. I pray someone finds it and understands. I pray the mirror tells its story. Sarah closed the journal with great care, tears slipping down her cheeks. Samuel had known, he had hoped, and now, more than a century and a half later, someone had finally witnessed the truth. Finding Rachel Martin, however, proved far harder than Sarah expected. The ship manifest confirmed that a woman with those initials had traveled to Nova Scotia, but Canadian records from the 1,860 seconds were incomplete, especially for black refugees who often changed names or vanished into communities that shielded them from American slave catchers who sometimes crossed borders. Sarah reached out everywhere she could: archives in Toronto, Halifax, and Montreal, online historical forums, genealogists who specialized in African-Canadian history. After 3 weeks, she received an email from Dr. James Robinson, a retired Toronto professor who had spent 4 decades studying black settlements formed after the Civil War. "I believe I've found your Rachel Martin," his email said. She lived in Canada under the name Rachel Morrison, a common protective practice. Census records list a Rachel Morrison arriving in Toronto in August 1868, around age 24, originally from Pennsylvania. She married a carpenter named Frederick Morrison in 1871. They had 4 children. She passed away in 1921 at the age of 77 and is buried in the Necropolis Cemetery. He attached scanned documents, a marriage certificate, birth records for the children, a death certificate, and one final item, a newspaper clipping from the Toronto Globe, dated 1919. It showed an elderly Rachel Morrison being honored by her church for half a century of service. The photograph was small and grainy, but Sarah could still see her, white hair, gentle eyes, surrounded by community members. The caption read, Missus. Rachel Morrison, a cherished member of First Baptist Church, had been honored for a lifetime of service to new arrivals in Toronto, helping countless families adjust to their new lives in freedom. She had dedicated her years to giving others the same chance that once saved her. Sarah leaned back in her chair, overwhelmed. The faint figure in the mirror, the woman who had once hidden, terrified in an attic, had lived a full life, married, raised children, built a community around her, and transformed her own fear into decades of compassion and service. But Dr. Robinson's message had contained even more. One of Rachel Morrison's great-granddaughters is still living in Toronto, he had written. Her name is Patricia Morrison Chen, a retired teacher. I mentioned your research to her, and she's eager to speak with you. She always knew her great-grandmother escaped slavery, but the details were never clear. Her email is below. Sarah contacted Patricia immediately, and they arranged a video call for the following night. Patricia, in her 70s, appeared on screen with silver braids and the same gentle eyes Sarah had seen in the old photograph. Tell me everything, she said as soon as the call connected. My great-grandmother never spoke about her escape. She only told my grandmother that angels in Philadelphia saved her life and that she owed everything to a family whose name she vowed never to reveal. Sarah shared the original photograph, the enhanced mirror image, and the excerpts from Samuel Williams' journal. She explained how the Williams family had been investigated, how narrowly their lives had escaped ruin, and how the truth had been buried for generations. Patricia cried freely. She kept her promise, Patricia whispered. She never told us their names, not once. Even when she was dying, even when my grandmother begged her to share more, she said it was too dangerous that those families could still be harmed. Patricia wiped her eyes, then paused. But she left something behind. Wait. She stepped away and came back holding a wooden box. These were my great-grandmother's keepsakes, letters, scraps of paper, a few personal objects. She opened it carefully and lifted out a folded, fragile sheet, yellowed with age. This was pinned inside her Bible, Patricia said. We found it after she passed. None of us understood what it meant. She held it up to the camera. In faded ink, written in careful, steady handwriting, were 4 lines. July 23rd, 1868. The day I became free. Thanks to the blacksmith's family and the little boy who watched over me. Sarah's eyes filled. That's Samuel, she whispered. He was 6 years old. He brought her food. He protected her. She never forgot. And now, Patricia murmured, voice breaking, we finally know his name. After all these years, we can at last say thank you. With Rachel Martin's identity confirmed, and with Patricia's blessing to share the story, Sarah returned to the studio ledgers with renewed purpose. If the Williams family and Rachel represented one successful journey, how many others had been hidden in those twilight sessions? Over the next 2 months, she cross-checked names, dates, and records. A pattern emerged. Approximately twice a month between 1866 and 1872, Whitman and Sons Photography held special evening appointments for black families. The ledger entries used coded phrases, package secured, departure confirmed, safe arrival noted. 17 families, Sarah discovered, had been part of this covert network. Using census files, city directories, and preserved newspaper stories, she traced their histories. The Patterson family, who operated a boarding house that became temporary refuge. The Hughes family, wagon builders whose equipment concealed hidden compartments. The Morris family, deeply connected to Philadelphia's black church community, identifying newcomers who needed help. Each household had taken enormous risks. Each had been questioned by authorities, and each had commissioned portrait sessions that presented them as respectable, law-abiding citizens, photographs that doubled as alibis. The message those portraits projected was unmistakable. Look at us. We are business owners, property holders, educated people. Would people like us commit crimes? But there was another layer, a far deeper one, revealed through records from local abolitionist groups. The photographer, James Whitman Jr., had not simply ignored what was happening. He was actively involved. His father, James Whitman Sr., had been an abolitionist before the Civil War, using photography to document the lives of formerly enslaved people and support legal claims for their freedom. After his father's death in 1865, Whitman Jr. quietly continued the mission. His studio's basement door opened into an alley that connected to remnants of old underground railroad routes. People could enter unseen, wait safely in a back room while a family posed for a portrait, and slip out again once the streets were empty. Whitman recorded everything in his own journal, a thin, worn book Sarah found in the archives. Evening session, Williams family. RM departed safely. 4th successful passage this month. Father would be proud. Authorities asking questions about late-night business. Must proceed with caution, but work continues. Portrait of Hughes family, including infant. First child born free in Canada to a family we aided. Small victories. Whitman Jr. died in 1934. His career had ended decades earlier, but not even his obituary hinted at what he had done. He carried the secret to his grave, shielding every family he had helped. But the portraits remained, silent witnesses of remarkable bravery, hiding their truths in shadows and reflections, waiting for someone to finally notice. 6 months after she first noticed the faint reflection in the Williams family image, Sarah stood in the main gallery of the Philadelphia Historical Society, watching visitors wander through the exhibition she had curated. Hidden in plain sight, Philadelphia's post-war Underground Railroad filled 2 rooms and told the story she had uncovered piece by piece. At the center hung the Williams family portrait displayed beside its enhanced counterpart, the image where Rachel Martin's reflection finally came into focus. Around it, arranged with care, were 16 more family portraits from the "See What Had Always Been There." The gallery's evening session wall displayed each family portrait with richly detailed panels explaining who these families were, the risks they accepted, and the lives they changed. Visitors could explore interactive screens that allowed them to zoom deep into each photograph, searching for hints in corners and reflections the way Sarah once had. Short films looped nearby, featuring interviews with descendants like Dorothy Peterson and Patricia Morrison, Chen faces from different cities and different generations, all linked by acts of quiet heroism. But nothing drew visitors quite like the glass case in the center of the room. Inside, illuminated by soft white light, lay Samuel Williams's journal, open to the page where he described being the little guardian who brought food to the terrified young woman hiding overhead. People lingered there longer than anywhere else, reading his careful script, their expressions shifting as they connected a child's bravery with the woman whose blurred reflection had sparked everything. Dorothy and Patricia stood together in front of the Williams portrait, meeting face to face for the first time despite a century of shared history. They had spent the morning trading stories, laughing at family quirks that echoed one another across generations, crying over losses that time could not erase. "My great-grandfather would be overjoyed," Dorothy said softly, motioning toward the exhibition. "He spent his life hoping someone would understand what that moment meant. Now thousands will." Patricia nodded, her gaze locked on the enhanced mirror image. "I grew up wondering what she looked like when she was young, what fear she carried, what hope she held onto, and now here she is, frightened, resolute, moments away from freedom." Her voice broke. "I'm seeing her face at last." A small boy, maybe 7, wandered toward the photograph with his parents. He pointed directly at young Samuel. "Why is he looking over there and not at the camera?" His mother read from the placard beside the frame. "Because he was watching someone who needed to stay hidden, someone he was helping. He was very brave." The boy thought about this, then declared with grave sincerity, "Like a superhero." His father smiled. "Exactly. A real one." Sarah watched them walk from display to display, the boy peppering his parents with questions. This moment of curiosity sparking empathy was why she believed in history, why she had dedicated her life to recovering stories nearly erased by time. Not for dates, not for academic footnotes, but for the reminder that courage is often ordinary, unshowy, and real. The exhibition would travel after Philadelphia, to Toronto first, then to Washington, and eventually to other cities where similar secret networks had once operated. Rachel Martin's journey and the Williams family's bravery would live on, taught, studied, understood. That night, when the museum went dark, Sarah stood alone before the original photograph. She imagined 6-year-old Samuel fighting the instinct to turn his head toward the camera, choosing instead to protect the woman he'd grown to care for in just 3 days. She imagined Rachel, exhausted from her 90-mile flight to Philadelphia, trusting a family she barely knew with her life. She pictured Thomas and Martha Williams keeping watch through the night, terrified of every knock on the door, committed to their choice anyway. She thought of James Whitman adjusting the lens, pretended professionalism, masking the awareness that the wrong visitor could end everything. The photograph, she realized, was a quiet monument to layered bravery captured in silver nitrate and kept alive by chance. 3 years passed. Then one morning Sarah opened her inbox to find an email titled, "You helped me find my family." The sender, Marcus Williams, a software engineer from Seattle, explained that he had visited the traveling exhibit while it was on the West Coast. Curious about his last name and family lore about ancestors from Philly, he began researching. His search led him to Thomas Williams Jr., the older brother standing beside Samuel in the photograph. "I had no idea," he wrote. "My dad said we had roots in Philadelphia, but nothing more. Knowing my ancestors took part in something so dangerous, so brave, it's changed how I see my own life. I understand now that I come from people who did what was right, even when it was dangerous." Sarah read his message twice, smiling. This was the outcome she had dreamed of: history mending the present, giving people a deeper sense of self. Stories poured in from others too. Some learned their forebears had been sheltered by families like the Williams. Others discovered their ancestors had offered that shelter. Each new revelation added another thread to the growing tapestry of a community that had once existed in silence. Dorothy passed away at 81, but before her death she recorded a full oral history. Her voice became the final audio of the exhibition, warm, steady, and proud, recounting Samuel's memories in her own words. Her account added humanity to the facts, ensuring that Samuel and his family would never again fade into obscurity. Meanwhile, Patricia wrote a book on Rachel Martin's Canadian life, using the restored photograph and Sarah's research as the foundation for exploring how formerly enslaved people built new, vibrant communities in Toronto. The book quickly became a staple in Ontario classrooms. The photograph itself took on a life of its own. It appeared in academic papers, documentaries, textbooks. Yet for Sarah, its magic remained personal. It had taught her that photographs were not just art, they were evidence, testimony, truth waiting in the corners. On July 23rd, the anniversary of both Rachel's photograph and Sarah's discovery, she returned to Philadelphia. She stood quietly on Race Street, where Whitman's studio had once stood. Cars and pedestrians drifted by, indifferent to the history beneath their feet. She imagined the scene as it had been in 1868, Samuel fidgeting but resolved, Rachel slipping through a dim back door, Thomas and Martha whispering last-minute instructions, and Whitman steadying his camera, hoping the shutter would open and close without summoning danger. Most of all, she pictured Samuel's wandering gaze, the smallest act in the room, a child's instinct to check on the person who mattered, and that simple turn of his head became the thread that survived, stretching across generations until someone finally noticed. Sarah lifted her phone and snapped a picture of the modern street. In the glass of the cafe behind her, she caught her own reflection surrounded by strangers, kids on scooters, a couple sharing a pastry, a courier rushing past. Ordinary people, people living their lives without knowing how courage might one day be required of them, just like the Williams family, just like Rachel Martin, just like every person whose faint reflection or soft shadow had carried truth across time, and just like every story still waiting to be discovered by someone willing to look closely